Frogman Friday.
Yeah, boy. What's up, guys? It's that time again. Welcome to the Frogman Friday show, presented by Transcend, the best peptide and hormone therapy. They put your health first so you can live more and worry less. Go to transcendcompany.com/Birdman to begin your wellness transformation today. Today, our badass guest is Ben Milligan. He served 7 years as a Navy SEAL, exiting service as a petty officer first class. He authored the book By Water Beneath the Walls, The Rise of the Navy SEALs, which debuted in 2021. You can follow Ben on IG, Twitter, and LinkedIn, handles to follow the show. To scoop up a copy, go to all major bookstores or Amazon. And for future projects in history, check out his website, benhmilligan.com. Brother, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ryan. Appreciate it.
Man of many words. I've seen you speak before, and it's interesting because when we typically hear team guys talk, it's a bunch of nonsense. And when he presented, it was about this book, and it was the most fascinating thing I've ever seen because a lot of us, when we go through BUDS, we learn a little bit of our history, but there's never a real in-depth discussion of like, how did we start? Who came up with the concept? What is this all about? And you just decided to take this massive deep dive and authored this amazing book. So before we even get started on the book, let's talk about what gets you so inspired about history and why did you go down this path?
Gosh, you had to ask that question first. When I got handed or when I was told that I was going to have to do promotion for this book, I never really thought about it. I was just working on the book for such a long time. I didn't really think, how am I going to promote this thing? But one of the first things that the publisher said, hey, people are going to ask you why you wrote this book and why you're interested in history. And I didn't have a great answer for it. I kind of grew up interested in history. I think it's probably just a personality glitch. I had a really close relationship with my maternal grandfather, who, when I was a very young guy, he was, kind of always reading to us. My dad was always reading to us, but he was always, reading history. And I just kind of caught his enthusiasm. When I was in junior high, he just started, he asked my parents for permission, and he just started every year on our fall break, he would take me to a different Civil War battlefield. And I just caught his enthusiasm. So I kind of grew up knowing that at one point I would probably write a history book. I didn't know what it was going to be. I think the only thing that I knew it wasn't going to be was a history of the SEAL teams. When I got out of the SEAL teams and I decided I was going to write a history book, a history of the SEALs was the last thing on my mind. It wasn't until probably 2011 that I really started to think back about my own experiences. I'd gotten out the year before. We had two big things that happened in 2011. One had the killing of Osama bin Laden, which was Red Squadron, and then we had the Extortion 1/7 tragedy, which was Gold Squadron. You have these two, monumentally important events in the history of the SEAL teams, and both had occurred, more than 600 miles away from the closest saltwater. That was interesting to me. Like, why are the SEAL teams involved, in these two, in the country's land wars, and why are we not just involved in them? Why are we, so, instrumental? Why are we? Why is the country, relied on naval special warfare, for its land wars for so long? And so I just started to, pull that thread, and it actually was the right about the same time. In fact, at John Tumilson's funeral, I met another historian who happened to also be a literary agent, and I just spent the evening talking to him. And at the end of the evening, I took his card. I didn't tell him anything about me having any interest in writing history myself. I just held onto his business card for a year, and in that year, I'd already been working on a couple of ideas. I got rid of those ideas, and I just started working on this. I just started reading a lot, and I started building this pretty lengthy timeline of the history of, not just naval special warfare, but all of these other units that had kind of grown alongside naval special warfare. And before I knew it, I was like, I think I got something here.
It's interesting. This is interesting, because you can say get as deep as you want, because I'm a history nerd. So nothing you're going to say is going to shock me. I'm all about it. So continue.
No, I mean, there was, by at the end of that year, I'd put together probably 10 or 15 pages of a sample chapter of what I thought this book would look like. I just sent a cold email to this guy, and he really liked it, and he, gave me kind of a punch card of everything else I would need for a proposal, and within 6 more months, I had everything on that, completed on that punch card. He took it to New York, and before I knew it, I had a contract. I'd never written anything before. They gave me a contract to write a history of the SEAL teams that would be 100,000 words and due in 2 years. 10 years later, when I actually turned in the manuscript, or excuse me, it was 8 years later when I turned in the manuscript. It was 250,000 words, and it was, 6 years late.
Well, I mean,
I didn't realize something was going to be.
This is no joke. This book is not a thin reading book. This is serious, comprehensive work. So talk about that. I mean, how do you dig into finding the history? Because I mean, there's only so much public stuff. So
Right.
how did you go about this?
Yeah, every chapter was different, and there was I mean, it was just really one step at a time, because I'd been a history major in college, but I'd never done any archival research. I'd considered, after I got out of the teams, I thought briefly about maybe doing an academia track. I had young kids though, and I was like, there's no way I'm going to be able to put myself through get a PhD and everything like that. So I really just kind of I just did it slowly. I mean, the first chapter that I wrote, I was able to do it mostly just from secondary sources and from archival material that I found online. I was like, this is great. There's so much that had been already printed or published on the history of the Marine Corps Raiders. I was like, this should be easy. I just have to subscribe to these various websites, and I'll be able to get after action reports and various things. What I didn't realize was after I got through that first chapter, how none of this stuff was anywhere. I was I had to go find it. I knew that my next chapter was going to be on the Army, Navy, Scouts, and Raiders, and none of that stuff existed. I ended up going to the SEAL Museum. They put me in touch with another guy who was where was he? In St. Petersburg, Florida. He was like a amateur historian. His house was literally full of scout documents on the Scouts and Raiders. I stayed in St. Petersburg for 2 or 3 days, just going through all of his material, just taking picture after picture after picture, and then I would take all those pictures, whether I was in an archive, or I would take those to Kinko's. I would print off all the thousands of photos I had taken, and I would just go through page after page after page, and underline, highlight, and figuring out, what's relevant, what helps, or, what's going to drive this narrative forward. So the research is tough for sure. And, research, is because you don't know what you're doing, or at least I didn't know what I was doing. You don't know where you're going to find things. You don't know if it's going to be in an archive. Like I would go on the National Archives website, and I would be so confident that I was going to find the exact information that I needed in this one box, in this one folder. And then I'd go to, Maryland, and I'd request the box, I'd request the folder, they'd bring it out, and there'd be nothing in the folder. It's just a process of well, maybe something's here, maybe something was misfiled. Now you don't have, so many of these, world-class archives. You can't go back and just start pulling files yourself. You've got to rely on an archivist to help you. So you've got to develop good relationships with archivists. In the case of the SEAL Museum, because the SEAL Museum had a lot of, a lot of documents, but they were just constantly going through construction down at Fort Pierce. So every time I would go down there, I would get down there, I would plan, a 3-day research trip or something like that. And almost every time I went down there, they forgot that I had, scheduled this research trip, and they were like, "Oh, we're under construction. You can't access the material." And I'd literally have to beg. I'd have to beg the archivist, and every time they granted my request. But I would get back into the records room, and everything, all the file cabinets would have been moved, and you're spending half of the morning trying to figure out just where Vietnam stuff is or where Korea stuff is. And then once you kind of had an idea of where it was, then you're just doing the best you can.
That's
Research
amazing.
is hard. Research is hard, but it's not the hardest thing. The hardest thing is writing. Writing is by far and I always say any idiot can research, but it's hard to write. It's hard to take all that stuff, that mountain of material that you find, and compress it, and find the story, and then compress it, and turn that into something that's sentence after sentence, one that's clear, but two is surprising, and 3 is just it tells a great story. So that's hard.
Well, you've taken a really unique approach here because, people don't know that there's correlation with the Scouts and Raiders, the NCDUs, then the predecessors, the UDTs, and then following into the SEALs. And I mean, when I was in the SEAL teams, I didn't know what the NCDUs or the Scouts and Raiders were. I'd heard maybe a blip, but I forgot, and I didn't know. You go to Fort Pierce, the museum, and you're like, what? Who are these groups? Oh, these are our founding fathers. Whoa. And then I got
Yeah.
to meet an actual NCDU from class 1, William Bill Dawson, and he became a good friend. And it's just like the nicest, most frail gentleman in the world who I'm like, you realize that you are one of the founding fathers of the teams today that killed the most wanted terrorist of all time. And he's just like smiling, like, and in the back of his mind, he's like, yeah, I know. But you took a really cool approach here because you explained to the reader how these meetings took place, these pre-meetings took place to actually create these groups. So you want to tap a little bit into that without giving too much away about the book?
Yeah, I mean you talked about it before, how you didn't know who these groups were. I didn't know who these groups were either. When I started, um, you know, I ignorantly thought, because the story hadn't been told, it probably wasn't a very good story. So why would I waste my time, trying to uncover a story that other authors had passed on, or other authors had not done a great job on. Um, but yeah, it was, like I said before, it was pulling the thread and figuring out, like, it was interesting just to find these connections, and you'd track, one person through, the Scouts and Raiders. And then that same person would have had a hand in creating NCDU Hell Week, and then that same person would have had a hand in the actual invasion reconnaissance in Normandy, and then that same person was, sent around the world to China as a guerrilla leader, as an amphibious Roger, and then that person would go to Korea and start working with the CIA, and before you know it, that's the person who's ultimately helping write the white paper for the SEAL teams. And you just kind of follow the individuals like that through history, and like, my gosh, there is this thread, and it was really cool to me because when I got in, when you got in, we knew what SEALs were. Um, we might not have known where the SEALs came from or anything like that, but we had some sense that the SEALs have the hardest training in the world, or that they do. Um, you know, they have this diving mission, which is really cool. They also have this land warfare capture kill mission, which is really cool. When these guys got in, to all of these various units, they had no idea what they were doing, and not only that, but they had no idea where these units would ultimately converge into this really incredible special entity. They were more than other units that I encountered. They were solving specific problems. When I spend, I don't know, 2, 3 chapters in the book talking about the Army's Rangers. The Army's Rangers, they have sort of an aspirational mission. You know, the guys that create them, they sort of see an opportunity. You know, there's a gap in the Army's order of battle for direct action raiders. Now there is the infantry, and the infantry can do direct action raiding, of course, but they're not really good at it. And we need the planners, they think we kind of need a unit that's going to go, that has the ability to go behind the lines and do some of these really special missions. But, they never really get buy-in from other people, and they never really sell the entire organization on this capability. And ultimately, the Rangers, in every iteration until 1974, they get disbanded. What's unique about naval special warfare are all these units that you talk about, the Scouts and Raiders, the NCDUs, the UDTs, the Amphibious Rogers. Each one of these units is created for a specific problem. The Scouts and Raiders are created because, well, the Navy needs to be able to identify beaches. They need to be able to mark those beaches. They need to be able to determine whether or not those beaches are actually usable. The NCDUs, they're literally created, for one mission, which is the demolition mission on D-Day, to blow these 50-yard gaps so tanks can get ashore. The underwater demolition teams, also, they're built for a very specific, pre-invasion reconnaissance mission and demolition mission to destroy the coral. Each one of these missions is incredibly hard. But it's also a very specific mission, whereas, the Rangers and all these other sorts of OSS type units, they kind of just got this sort of vague, opportunity that they might be able to satisfy. Whereas, NSW's got, each one has this very, very specific, identifiable, and achievable mission, which, is interesting because, all these units, they end up solving each of these missions or solving each of these problems. And then they, each one of these units ultimately says, well, what next? Which is interesting because, Navy planners hadn't really thought about that.
Quite interesting. Yeah. When we were laughing because when we went through BUDS, we were like, we had just gotten a taste of the UDT in the class, the UDT backdrop, the history lesson in the classroom, and they're like, we're doing a bunch of UDT stuff in the SEAL training. And so when you get out, you're like, man, I feel like I'm more a UDT than I am a SEAL,
Yeah.
And when I was growing up, I had a Vietnam, one of those posters for recruiting that was basically, it said Navy SEALs, but it was Vietnam picture, right?
Yeah.
And so ultimately, this is all I had to go off of. And these dudes are huge and they got the mustaches from the 80s. And I'm like, this is exactly what I want to be and what I want to look like. And, nobody else understood it. But then you get to the SEAL team and it's completely different than all the training that you were exposed to during BUDS. And that was so unique to me. But again, I didn't know anything about the history. And that's the special thing, because you cannot really do the job to the fullest effect if you don't know where you come from, because then it all makes sense. It really puts everything into perspective. So, this is the first time that anybody's ever put a comprehensive book before together, because anytime a SEAL writes a book, we all know that's the running joke, like everybody's got another book. But this one, when it comes out, everybody's like, oh, I can't wait. This is the book right here. This is the deal, because everybody wants to know.
You want to know why SEALs write books?
Okay. Can't wait.
People buy them. That's
a good point. It's a good point.
No, I mean, I know exactly what you're talking about. Like none of us could connect, the lessons that we were learning with in BUDS with the mission of the SEAL teams. And when you get to you're going through BUDS and you're doing all of this water stuff, and then you get to the SEAL teams and you're doing all of this land stuff. You're doing, constant CQB runs and all the rest, and you feel more like a Navy Ranger than you do a SEAL when you get to the SEAL teams. But it's interesting because the instructors that put us through that training, they didn't know where this training came from either. They were the caretakers of that training, as every instructor of BUDS ultimately becomes. They become a caretaker of it. This is what I went through, so you're going to go through this, without realizing that there are actual real reasons that we have all these things in training. There's, there, um, and I mean, nothing so um, convinces me of the utility of that training, or the legitimacy of SEAL training, more than the D-Day story, more than the creation of Hell Week and the Draper Kaufman story, and why Hell Week, is created, and then why it gets validated by, the success of D-Day. It's a no-fail mission. It's an impossible mission. It's a mission that the Navy has never expected that they're going to be sent on. Um, and and when Draper Kaufman creates Hell Week, because this is an impossible mission, so we need guys that can do impossible things. I mean, the Navy isn't quite prepared, for what they've asked for. Hell Week, from the very beginning, was controversial. I mean, we see articles today, in the New York Times or the Washington Post about Hell Week, and do we really need Hell Week anymore? And it's a great question. Every generation, though, asks that same question. When I was doing the research, I would, come across about every 10 years, in the research, I would find a report. This senator has a question about this, the difficulty of training, or the Navy wants to know why there are so many um, uh, folks that aren't making it through training. Why do we have Hell Week? And the Navy, the SEAL teams, or UDT, they had to explain, to the Navy why this, why we have this. And it's not until the guys that go through that first iteration of Hell Week accomplish that impossible mission at D-Day of blowing those beach obstacles and suffering some of the absolute worst casualty rates of the entire invasion, that planners say back to the NCDU schoolhouse, oh, okay, we get it, we understand, and they're not going to disband. They're not going to disband the NCDUs, but two, they're not going to get rid of Hell Week as the cornerstone of that training. So that's it's just we just don't get explained that when we go through it. We just think Hell Week is this shitty thing that we all have to do. No, it's not. It's something that this institution has to know. One, that you're capable of doing this, physically capable of doing this, but also it's an impossible course. You can't do this without cutting corners or learning the corners that you're able to cut. And that's what we want. We want guys that are able to handle that impossibility of combat and solve those, little problems. Oh, anyway, that's probably enough.
So NCDUs, they create Hell Week. We had, I mean, I think Hell Week was either the third week or the fifth week in SEAL training or BUDS, up until today, when it was created in 62. But Hell Week was the first week, if I'm not mistaken, when it was originally created.
It depends. It depends where it was. So there was a pipeline to get to NCDU training. So before you could actually start the NCDU schoolhouse at Fort Pierce, you did a couple of weeks at Camp Perry with the Seabees up in Virginia. That was sort of they would do an initial assessment for the NCDUs, then they would come down to Fort Pierce. And I don't know if there was I can't remember if there was an indoctrination week or something like that. But yeah, it was if not the first week, it was the first or second week. So you were being assessed almost immediately, and you were getting thrown into a boat crew, and then everything after that conditioning week was actual training. You were learning how to destroy beach obstacles and learning the tactics of sneaking up onto a beach and things like that.
It's incredible, right? Because you think about, like, we understand, we get the BUDS, we have a lead into it. We had some in-doc, and we had a couple weeks before Hell Week, and to be going towards a new unit that has no marketing on it, and now you're thrown right into this gnarly week. It's interesting to think about. Even, having gone through it, it's really interesting.
They had some sense of what they were doing, though. This didn't make the book because I didn't learn about this until after the book. But when Draper Kaufman gets the mission to create this, the schoolhouse and this training, he's been he's probably seen the most combat of any American at that point in the war. He's been an ambulance driver for the French army. He's been a POW in a German prisoner of war camp. He's been a bomb disposal officer for the Brits during the Blitz. He's been at Pearl Harbor as a bomb disposal officer. He's seen a lot, and he's experienced combat. He knows how hard it is. He knows how you're almost never are you going to get into combat completely rested and fully fed. He knows how prepared people have to be in order to endure this. But it's what was interesting to me is instead of just putting this curriculum together himself, he had the sort of foresight to talk to other people who had been through similar experiences. He talked to the Scouts and Raiders who were down there, half of the Scouts and Raiders instructors were former NFL superstars. He talked to other Navy guys that had also experienced combat, and when he's sort of sitting around this round table and they're going through their initial planning sessions to create this training, he's asking guys, he's like looking for opinions. How hard should this training be? It's an impossible mission, so how difficult should it be? Should it be twice as hard as normal combat training? Should it be 3 times as hard? And there was one chief petty officer, and I've never been able to figure out who this one chief petty officer was, who just puts a hand on the table and he says it should be 10 times as hard.
Sounds like a chief.
It does. It sounds like a hard-bitten Navy chief who probably has experienced Pearl Harbor or something similar to that. And that became the standard. And Draper, not only supports his chain of command and advocates for it, when the chain of command comes down on him and tries to get rid of the course, he ultimately volunteers and puts himself through the course. So,
pretty awesome.
It's an awesome story. Yeah, it's really cool.
What is one thing in the book? What is your favorite part, or something unique to you?
The last chapter, because it was the last chapter.
That's
no, they're all. I like all of them. Each chapter is its own book, really, because you got. There are no 2 chapters that sort of flow into each other. The way that I structured the book, and this was intentional, was to take a reader, and I wanted a reader to experience the entire war, not just World War II, but I wanted them to experience all of Korea, all of the interwar periods, and and all of Vietnam. So there are no 2 chapters that are in the same theater. And each chapter is written chronologically. So you don't, there's no 2 chapters where you have to double back, and kind of cover the same ground. So that was a really kind of tricky thing to learn how to do as a writer. But I liked them all. I have a special connection to the chapters I didn't want to write. I didn't want to write my chapter on the Navy in China. That was the story about the Navy Sino-American Cooperative Organization, which was an almost unknown, untold, kind of backwater corner of the war that happens towards or becomes important towards the tail end of World War II. Not a lot of folks had written about it. And I figured, like I said before, there's probably a good reason that nobody's written about it. It's kind of a boring, inconsequential corner of the war. Not a lot of Americans are killed in that conflict. And I think at least, I think most people, try, whether it's right or wrong, we ascribe importance to, casualty figures. Was the platoon in Vietnam that's suffers the most casualties, or who was the team in the war on terror that suffered. We tend to do that, and I thought because we didn't suffer a lot of casualties at in China, it probably wasn't, that consequential. Um, which, it's about like saying that Utah Beach was not consequential because we didn't suffer as many casualties at Omaha Beach. And Utah Beach is where everything went right. I mean, it should be studied. So I was at a point where I was ready, when I started to write chapter 6, which is my China chapter. I was ready to move on to Korea. I'd done 5 chapters on World War II at that point. It had taken me 2 years to get to that. I knew that it was going to take me at least 1 more year to write, about naval special warfare in Korea, and naval special warfare in Vietnam. I thought, well, maybe the publisher will understand if I'm 1 year over my deadline. And I was like, there's no way I can, write about the Navy in China. I just don't have the bandwidth. So I thought, this is what I'll do. I will write an introduction paragraph in my chapter on the Navy, or on the UDT in Korea, and I will talk about, some of the guerrilla stuff that the Navy did in China during World War II. So I got a couple of books, and I started to, take some of the research material, and I started to put it into this paragraph. Before I knew it, that paragraph was 2 paragraphs. I was like, okay, 2 paragraphs is a little long for an introduction, but I think it's okay. Before I knew it, that 2 paragraphs was a full page, and then it was 2 pages. Before I knew it, it was 6 pages. I was like, what are you doing? It was ultimately, that's when I ultimately just had to put my plan aside. And I was like, this is a really important chapter in the history of naval special warfare. It has to be told. No one's done it before. It's fascinating. I'm fascinated with it. I got, hooked onto this thing, doing my absolute best to not get hooked. And it did. It took me about 18 months. So it took me 18 months to write 1 chapter, to learn all the history of the China War and then write it. So I do have a connection to that chapter, because that was the moment where I was like, I had to decide, are you trying to write a book and just, take the money and run from the publisher, or are you trying to do something that is going to stand the test of time? Is this going to be a project that you're going to be, proud of? And that was the choice I made. So I'm connected to that chapter. There was a chapter on the Green Berets that I didn't want to write about the Green Berets either. That was my 10th chapter. I was like, my whole thesis in the book was, that the SEAL teams get created because, all of these other special operations units don't exist. The Marine Corps Raiders have been created, then disbanded. The Army Rangers have been created, then disbanded. So naturally, when we get to Vietnam, of course, you're going to turn to the SEAL teams to be the go anywhere commando force. The problem with that thesis, though, was that the Green Berets already existed, and they'd existed for 10 years. And not only had they existed for 10 years, but they were everywhere in Vietnam. So I didn't know what I was going to do. Like, I'd been writing, each chapter with this sort of thesis in my head. And I just thought, well, maybe readers won't pay any attention, and I'll just be able to get, hoodwink them and, make them forget that the Green Berets existed. I didn't know what I was going to do. It took me writing my chapter on the Green Berets, that took a year. And it took a year because I had to become an expert on what the Green Berets were in Vietnam, what they had been intended to be, and what they ultimately became, and how what they became, this sort of counterinsurgency force, which was not, the commandos that they had originally been created as, why that counterinsurgency footing had left this massive gap, for the Navy to, come in and fill. But yeah, I ended up writing 13 versions of that chapter before I ultimately settled on the structure that would actually work. But now it's required reading at USASOC. The commander of USASOC just had made that chapter mandatory reading for all of his commanders, and then they had a Zoom call to discuss it. So I guess it was worth it.
That's a What's a great segue into exactly what I was going to ask next, which is, I mean, is this required? Is this day one of buds now? Do they get issued a copy?
I don't know if it's I know that it is it's recommended reading for um I know it's recommended reading a green team. I believe it's required reading for senior level officers and NCO or senior enlisted within the entire um, NSW structure. I don't. That's what I've been told, um, and I know it's required reading at some other places too.
That's awesome. That's awesome, man. Well, I'll tell you
Unex-
what, I we're gonna put this thing out. We're gonna blast it out to everybody. If you haven't seen this or you've never heard of it, obviously I said you can get it anywhere. Go pick up a copy and read because everybody is interested in the Navy SEALs, but now you're gonna get a really in-depth look at where we come from, where our predecessors were, what they founded, why we are, and what we do by design, instead of just the cool guy factor of it, which is, all the other books that basically got us in along with Charlie Sheen. Um, I always like to end on this one because it's definitely off topic, but just to bring it home, if there's a story that you can share about a brother of yours that you served with that either did something heroic, anything along the way that you learned in the SEAL teams from somebody who you admired. A lot of guys honor a brother that they lost. And so just wanted to know a little bit about that, maybe a story that people don't know.
Sure. So there, I have to tell two stories, but they're connected. So, when I started to, one of the first research trips that I took was to the SEAL Museum, and I wasn't sure what the book was at that point. I knew it was going to be a history of the SEAL teams, but I didn't have any sort of organizing idea of what the book was going to be about. I didn't have a good question, to organize to give me sort of boundaries on where to start the book, where to stop the book. What's going to be the driving question. I found a report in one of the files at the SEAL Museum. It was not where it was. This report was not where it was supposed to be. If I remember correctly, it was in a World War II folder, and it was written. It had been written during the Vietnam War, and the premise of the report. It was the first academic report that had ever been written about the SEAL teams. It was had been sponsored by the Rand Corporation, and this report asked the question. Why are the SEALs in Vietnam? Why are they doing this commando mission when the Army is not doing it? And how did this organization ever come to exist? It was written by a former Force Recon Marine, guy by the name of Francis West, and the report just kind of stuck in my head. And ultimately, the question that author asked became the question that I needed to find out. I needed to understand, the answer to that question. I think we'd all been, every SEAL that came up, that has come up, through the organization has at some point felt a little self-conscious about the land warfare mission that we have. I was in Iraq in 2006, 2007, and there was a number of times where we were, doing these capture kill missions out in Al Anbar alongside Marines, and we were the by far the more forward leaning force. And I think there was never a day that the Marines were didn't ask themselves, why are these SEALs here? Why are these SEALs doing this mission? Now, there's one particular mission that I was on that was that contradiction became very, very noticeable. We were on a sniper overwatch mission. We'd been working with the Marines for several months. There was a town, that was sort of somewhere between Habbaniyah and Ramadi, that was sort of a vacation area for Al Qaeda in Iraq. So we'd been spending a lot of time developing sources in the area, and looking at different houses from which we could stage a couple of interlocking sniper positions to support Marine patrols. So we were on this one mission, and at one point we were ambushed by the insurgents. One of our SEALs was shot through the eye, and he needed medevac immediately. The problem was we couldn't get our Casevac helicopters down. I was doing everything I could to signal these Casevac helicopters down. Just wouldn't come down. The firefight was so intense. So we contacted the Marine QRF. Now the Marine QRF was several miles away. Most of the Marines were already on this patrol that we were supporting. There was one Marine lieutenant who was back at the FOB. He commandeers 2 Humvees, and he just makes this mad dash up this IED alley. Now we hadn't inserted via trucks because this road was known to be always mined. We never drove up it because anytime anyone ever drove up it, they became a casualty. This Marine, he takes 3 other Marines and 2 vehicles, and they just they make it to our position. They put a smoke screen up. They put heavy guns online between us and the insurgency, and the helicopters ultimately come down. Now the Marine that led that commandeered those vehicles was Owen West. Owen West was the son of Francis West, a guy who wrote that report that ultimately gave me the question for the book. And that's not something I learned until several months after the book had come out.
Wow. That is beyond powerful. Whew. That gave me chills, man. That is amazing. Looks like we have to do a mod 2 of this book and put that right in the back or in the front. That is amazing. Wow.
Well, Francis West is better known as Bing West. And I didn't know this, but Bing West was ultimately one of the first people to champion this book. He's on the back cover as one of the guys who sent a blurb in.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I can't thank you enough, brother, for spending your time here today, but more importantly, just spending 10 years of your life. Is it 10 years putting this book together?
It took about 1.5 years to put the proposal together and get the contract, and another 7 years to actually write the book and turn in the first draft of the manuscript, and then another year and change to finish, with doing all the endnotes and everything. It's funny because every time I thought I was done and I'd gone through, an editing process, I'd get, different people would call with more information, or I'd find a new document. And I literally wrote this thing until 2 weeks before the book came out. The editor had to contact me and say, stop, no more. You can't make any more changes. And I just would have kept, I'd still be working on it now if they hadn't pulled it away from me.
Wow. Wow. Well, thanks, man, for doing this, because this book, for everybody who's been through SEAL training, this brings it home for all of us. It gives us really a good taste of who we are, our culture, and why we were, created and what we do. And then for everybody who's a reader and an avid reader, doesn't matter if you're a history buff or not, everybody loves Navy SEALs. Go buy a copy of this book. Go buy a copy. Thank you for being on, brother. I appreciate you.
My pleasure. Absolutely. Thanks for doing everything that you're doing to help guys out.
That was cool. I can tell you that I won't just read it once or twice, but this will be a book that I continue to go back to, because learning about the history of the SEAL teams and our predecessors, why we exist, it's a really riveting story. So go show Ben Milligan some love. Go pick up a copy of this book at all major retailers. Go do it today. If you're a history buff, also go check out Sons of the Flag, The Last 100 Years of American Service on Amazon. Remember to check out transcendcompany.com/Birdman to begin your health and wellness journey today. I can tell you there is no perfect time like the present to start your health and wellness journey. So go check out Transcend Company. They're a great partner. They're a fantastic company, and they're even better friends. I want you to follow my charities hot list. I've got a couple that I support: sonsoftheflag.org, birdseyeviewproject.org, guardiangrange.org, transcendfoundation.com, and navysealsfund.org. Also, and last but not least, go check out on Instagram at 7x.project as we finish the Human Performance Project, and we're going to release the manual and the documentary. So stay up to date with us so that you can see when everything's coming out, and buy your health and wellness manual and get your life going. So appreciate you watching the show. Go check out the book, Ben Milligan, By Water Beneath the Walls, The Rise of the Navy SEALs. Go pick it up.
Frogman Friday.